Breaking news. The possible implications of the Wagner Group's armed rebellion for Russia's grand strategy in Ukraine. Ukraine's counteroffensive has been going strong for weeks, but new questions have arisen about the war and the implications of Vladimir Putin's invasion as a result of political unrest in Russia. Forces with the Russian paramilitary organization Wagner Group withdrew from the front line in Ukraine late last week and seized control of military facilities in Rostov-on-Don, a key Russian city near the Ukrainian border, in a brief but shocking show of rebellion against Russia's top military brass. The mercenary leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, had them turn around and head back to their field camps in Ukraine on Saturday because he didn't want any Russian blood spilled while they were on their way to Moscow. Over Putin's more than 20 years in power, the 24-hour mutiny was the greatest challenge to his authority. Volodymyr Zelensky, president of Ukraine, responded that Russia showed signs of full-scale weakness. Despite the short-lived excitement, the 600-mile front in southern and eastern Ukraine remains largely unchanged as Ukrainian forces search for breakthroughs in what continues to be a very long, hard, difficult, and bloody fight, as one expert put it. It's important to take what was going on with Prigozhin and with Putin and put that into a Russia context, because that's something that's going on behind the scenes in Russia, said Ganyard. There won't be any noticeable impact on the battlefield just yet. Nothing has changed on the battlefield. A long, hard slog of a counterattack. After months of inactivity over the winter, during which time the Russians had ample time to construct 3 lines of defense consisting of minefields, tank traps, and trenches, the Ukrainians finally began their probing operations, as reported by Ganyard. Noting that the Ukrainians haven't even gotten through the first line of defense, he referred to the defensive perimeters lining the front. If Ukraine has the resources to break through those defenses, Ganyard believes the war could be coming to an end sooner rather than later. For nearly a century, the world has not witnessed a battle of this magnitude. He compared the situation to the Western Front during World War I, when progress was measured in hundreds of feet per day, due to the necessity of using trenches. Even today, he continued, when there are some quote-unquote breakthroughs going on, the Ukrainians were only able to advance by about a mile per day. It's going to be a long, tough slog. Blood will be shed, resources will be exhausted, and many lives will be lost in the process. It may take weeks or months for Ukrainian forces to make a potentially catastrophic breakthrough that could signal success, according to Ganyard, as they search for weaknesses and lightly manned places along the long front line as they advance. Ukraine has had more time to train its soldiers with new US and NATO equipment thanks to the winter's static battlefield, so, theoretically it's a better military than it was, say, 12 or 14 months ago, Ganyard said. However, Russia has an advantage by being on the defensive and protected behind the multiple layers of trenches. Ukraine may also be outnumbered, with the general truism in war, stating that an attacker has a 3-to-1 advantage over a defender. According to Ganyard, if things go badly for the Ukrainians, where they continue to lose men and machines at a rate that they can't replace, then we are looking at another few months where we may end up in stalemate. So it's really going to depend on how well the Russians defend, whether the Ukrainians can find a breakthrough, the author writes, and whether the Ukrainians have the means and the will to continue a fight even when they are at sort of parity in a very defensive position with the Russians. At the outset of Ukraine's counteroffensive, the Institute for the Study of War predicted that the scale and intensity of the attack would fluctuate over many weeks, with the first phase likely being the most difficult and slowest, and resulting in the greatest Ukrainian losses due to the well-prepared defense. The penetration stage of a mechanized offensive is the most risky and expensive, it says. The results of this stage may not be visible for some time. When speaking to the BBC last week, Zelensky acknowledged that progress has been slower than desired. There are those who think this is a movie and demand instant gratification. Zelensky argued, it is not. It would be premature to estimate how long the counteroffensive could last, according to Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Mark Milley, who said last week at a news conference in Brussels that Ukraine is in the early stages of its offensive operations because there are several 100,000 Russian troops dug in and prepared positions all along the front line. This is an extremely challenging battle. This is a very bloody battle. And it'll be expensive and time-consuming, he warned. Possible consequences of the Wagner rebellion. The Wagner Group led by Prigozhin posed the most significant challenge to the Russian state in recent times, as stated by the British Ministry of Defence on Saturday. Speaking to reporters this week, State Department spokesman Matthew Miller said it is too soon to tell what effect the Wagner rebellion will have in Ukraine. Prigozhin and Sergei Shoigu, the Russian Minister of Defense, and General Valery Gerasimov, the head of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, had been at odds for months over how to handle the ongoing war in Ukraine. Prigozhin, a former Putin ally, claimed that the Russian military had deliberately shelled his fighters in Ukraine in the lead-up to the uprising. The Kremlin announced an agreement in which Prigozhin and his mercenaries would be granted amnesty and allowed to relocate to Belarus, while the Russian government extended an offer of enlistment to the mercenaries. President of Belarus Alexander Lukashenko said he was instrumental in negotiating the agreement. Prigozhin, in his first public comments after the march to Moscow, hailed the Wagner Group as the most experienced and combat-ready unit in Russia, and possibly in the world. Ganyard argued that it might be in Ukraine's best interest to remove Prigozhin and any Wagner forces from the fight. Whatever happens to the Wagner troops as a result of their disillusionment, the most crucial outcome is that they are removed from the battlefield. Ganyard argued that it was the only thing that could help the Ukrainian resistance. The Wagner troops were among the most effective and capable on the battlefield. However, right now the defensive fight the Russians are able to put up with their multiple layers of defenses are going to be very, very tough for the Ukrainians to break through, he added. The Institute for the Study of War recently concluded that the ongoing Putin-Lukashenko-Prigozhin powerplay is not yet over and will continue to have short-term and long-term consequences that may benefit Ukraine, such as diverting heavy weaponry and tanks from internal security to the Ukrainian military. Mikhailo Podolyak, an advisor to the Ukrainian president, told ABC News that he is, without a doubt, confident that the recent armed uprising marks the beginning of the end of the conflict in Ukraine. During an interview on Saturday in Kyiv, Podolyak said, "The problem is this end can last for quite a while and we have to understand that. Russia has accumulated a lot of internal problems, but they are not ready to accept defeat because it would put an end to 2 decades of its domination in global processes," he continued. To paraphrase what I've always said, the end of war must not mean just a victory for Ukraine. This would spell the end of Russia's ambitions. It should lead to Russia's own reformatting. Knowing about the armed uprising in Ukraine could also hurt Putin's war effort. On Tuesday, a high-ranking U.S. official asked, "How do you motivate these guys who don't want to be the last guy to die for a losing cause?" Rather than being a mutiny by regular Russian troops, Ganyard pointed out that the Wagner Group revolt was actually a mutiny by a mercenary force. That being the case, we don't know how the regular Russian troops might have felt about this, he said. What we're seeing here is very different from, say, a mutiny within the Russian military. Russia's leadership is not necessarily coherent, Milley said, and many of them don't even know why they're there. Since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, moral superiority has been a major factor, according to Ganyard, even if Ukraine does not have a 3-to-1 advantage. That their cause is, in their minds, beyond question. According to Ganyard, that's not the case on the Russian side. In war, the moral is to the physical as 3-to-1, Napoleon once said. Those who believe that their cause is just and righteous have a 3-to-1 advantage over those who disagree. The Russians are in the wrong here. The Russians were the attackers, he went on to say, and the Ukrainians are just trying to get back what was rightfully theirs. So the Ukrainians do have the kind of morale, the kind of support, the kind of esprit that is important to be able to continue these hard-slog, bloody kinds of conflicts. According to Ganyard, a negotiated settlement is possible if the standoff wears down the men and machines on both sides. That's a political risk that neither Zelensky nor Putin can afford right now.